All right, before we get into the main topic of this lecture, just a brief review of what we were looking at and talking about last week. We're talking about this notable era in world history and the history of the West we call the Renaissance, and it's centered mainly in Italy and mainly associated with the city of Florence, but it quickly rapidly spreads to throughout the boot of Italy, and as we'll see later, excuse me, it spreads up into Northern Europe and in many ways around the world. And what the Renaissance, again, the word means a rebirth, a rediscovery. It's a rise of a more kind of humanist view towards human culture. It's a rediscovery of classical learning. By that we mean that the learning of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, their art, philosophy, rhetoric, architecture, sculpture, across the board. And a lot of this knowledge had kind of gone underground during this era that we call the medieval period. And we have this kind of rediscovery of lots of this kind of stuff, and it explodes and it flowers, again, particularly in Florence, and then quickly becomes kind of its own thing. As we also noted last time, the era is also marked by kind of a thaw in terms of the influence of the Catholic Church. Now, as we'll see, the Catholic Church is very much still dominant, a huge player, not just in the spiritual lives of the peoples of Europe, but also in the political and physical day-to-day lives. But we do start to see this kind of this growing dichotomy, this growing distinction between what we call the sacred and the secular. And so there's a growing fervor to kind of understand humanity and the history of humanity and the future of humanity in secular humanist terms, and apart from just kind of the iron fist that the Catholic Church had on almost all of this stuff in the previous centuries. But as we'll see, the Church is absolutely essential when we understand kind of the full story of the Renaissance. As I have here, the Church is the most preeminent patron of Italian Renaissance art, paying huge sums of money to bring in artists, lots of Florentine artists, down to the Vatican, down to Rome, to paint and to sculpt and to beautify the churches and the buildings of the Vatican and throughout Italy. But also, as we noticed last time, we start to see some of these private patrons, most notably the Medici family, this very wealthy, extremely wealthy banking family in Florence, start to get in the game and commission artists all on their own. And so we have these, reopening of these dormant trade routes, which are bringing spices and silk and fabrics and other valuable materials from all over the world. And we see a really kind of a rise of a kind of cutthroat capitalism, with a number of very wealthy families kind of rising to the top in power and influence, and leaving their own stamp on this era that we call the Renaissance, as we talked about last time, the Medici family at length. Now, the main topic of this particular lecture is focused on the man you see here, Filippo Brunelleschi. And he's probably not the best known name that we associate with the Italian Renaissance, but he's an absolutely central player in this larger story. He is remembered mainly for his architectural achievements. He was an incredibly inventive engineer and an architect, but he left a lot of important legacies behind in terms of art and perspective, as we'll see. Now, I think I noted this in last week's lecture, that one of these, I love this detail, is that in the 14th century, in the 1300s, Florence decided it needed a cathedral to start to rival some of the other cities throughout Europe, which were putting up these massive, Gothic cathedrals, and Florence didn't have one. And so they wanted to build, the greatest cathedral that any city had. And so they built this massive thing, but they built it without the knowledge of how to put a dome over the altar. And so the church was built, and for decades it sat there with no dome covering, the altar, where the priest would give the homily, where he would celebrate mass. And so, rain and sometimes snow just kind of coming in through the open dome. But this, again, I love that detail because it's this extreme optimism. This is, well, we don't know how to build the dome now, but someday we will. And someday someone's going to come along to cap that cathedral with a new way of engineering these kinds of things. And the man who came along to do just that is this guy right here, Filippo Brunelleschi. And so it's his story that I want to kind of talk about this incredible project of doming the Florence Cathedral. So yeah, 1418, the massive church had been built with its bell tower, out of kind of priceless local marbles, but they left it to kind of uncapped here because they didn't know how to build a dome that wouldn't simply collapse under its own weight, and it needed a massive dome. So today, in Florence, the cathedral still dominates the urban landscape, such as it is. Florence, as I noted last week, is a city that still very much feels like it's in that Renaissance era. And back then, the biggest building was meant to be the church, the cathedral. Now, technically, in terms of height, the Florence Cathedral is not the tallest building. There are kind of political buildings which kind of rival it, which is interesting in and of itself. In fact, you can see from this photograph, which is taken from a taller building, not that far away, we see the cathedral now with its grand Brunelleschi dome on top of it. While not the tallest building, still dominating. It jumps up out of the urban landscape, and that is certainly, at least partially, by design. So the Florentines decided, as Florence started to become very wealthy with the opening of its trade routes, and it became kind of a crossroads of culture and banking, as we saw, they decided that now was the time. And so they held a contest, and they invited various artists and architects to submit their designs. Like, how, if you were going to cap this dome, how would you do it? And long story short, it kind of came down between these two artists, Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. And there's a famous anecdote, which probably isn't true, but that Brunelleschi came in and he was going to give him his pitch. And what he simply did is he brought in an egg, and he kind of tapped an egg down on the table in front of the judges, so the bottom kind of flattened out, and so the top of the egg remained standing there upright, in the way that the dome it has kind of an ovoid egg shape to it. And he says, just as this egg does, I want to imitate nature and put a dome of the same look on top. Like I said, probably isn't true. If he had done such a stunt, it probably would not have impressed a group of judges. But Brunelleschi, his personality survives as kind of very brusque, to the point, and brimming with confidence, and so the story kind of fits that rather than being literally true. So whatever Brunelleschi submitted, it impressed the judges, and he won the commission to build the dome. Ghiberti got second prize, and so he was allowed to build the baptistry and design the baptistry down here, which is also kind of extraordinary in its own right. We'll look at that in just a moment as well. So building the dome. So here was the problem. Nobody had built a dome of that size before, bigger than the Pantheon in Rome. There was an ancient Roman building that has this massive dome on it. We'll look at it in just a moment. But it was one of these things, of course, people living in Italy could see the Pantheon. It was a building that was built in the 100s. And, we're talking 1400 years before Brunelleschi. This building had been sitting in Rome. But nobody could really figure out how the Romans did it. It was part of this lost knowledge that had to be rediscovered. And so all kinds of engineering problems in putting a dome of that size anywhere, or in this case, bigger. Issues of compression, weight distribution, they didn't fully understand them. Florence would not allow buttresses that, some of these Gothic cathedrals that they were building in other parts of Europe had, large, massive stone buildings going way up high. And the way that they kept them from collapsing on themselves was they put these big curved frames, almost like a rib cage that was outside of the building, kind of like big hands just kind of holding the whole thing up. Well, the Florentines found that kind of visually unattractive. I tend to agree. And so they said, we're not going to have these giant kind of gawky, like stone arms just holding the building up. We got to figure out how to do this so it will stand on its own. And so there's all kinds of engineering and practical issues to be developed. And so Brunelleschi is the man for the job. He invents a new masonry hoisting machine. And one of the problems was, even if you're going to build this, how are you going to get all of this really heavy material way up there and allow workmen to put this thing together? And so he invented a hoisting machine to get materials up high and rapidly. He also, I'll have another slide that illustrates this, but you see in the back slide, these little mini domes on the outside. He says, okay, well, if you aren't going to let me have buttresses, I'll have kind of these half domes and these quarter domes that just kind of sit alongside, and they act as buttresses, but they're not as visually unattractive. You're not seeing kind of the interior, like I said, rib cage of the building. You kind of hide it, pleasingly in these semi-domes. And then he also built this before he kind of laid the dome, he built an interior wooden frame, wood, very light, and it was temporary. And then once he had set that up, he would kind of lay and put the bricks together and the other stone pieces on the wooden frame. And once that all kind of held together by means of its own kind of weight together, you could remove the wooden frame and the whole thing would stand on its own. And he also comes up with an ingenious way of laying bricks up here, get lighter material than trying to hoist marble up there and other kinds of stone. And at the end of the day, he and his workmen laid over 4 million bricks and laid them in a zigzag pattern. I'll show you a close-up. So here's like a Gothic cathedral elsewhere in Europe. This is what I mean by the buttress. So here's the main kind of nave of the church, and it was made of this really heavy stone. And if you didn't have kind of these big arms basically holding up the walls, the whole thing would collapse under its own weight. And the Florentines said, we get why you do it. It's just ugly. We don't want that, and we want to do something bigger and better. Now, one of the buildings that inspired Brunelleschi, this is the Pantheon building. That word Pantheon means it was originally designed as a temple for all the gods, Pan, all, Theon, the gods. And it was built by the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century A.D. And it's a remarkable building in that it's one of the very few from that old, going back to Rome, that more or less stands fully intact. And it's a very unique kind of example of one. The front of it looks like a typical, kind of Greek-style, Roman-style temple with a triangular pediment and the columns in the front. But that leads you into a circular, one big circular room, and then capped by this massive dome, which stands intact to this very day. You can see some of the alleys and buildings of modern Rome that surround the piazza in front and around it. And it's also marked by the dome is open. It has what they call an oculus, an eye. And to this day, rain and on the rare occasion that Rome gets snow, comes right into the building and into the marble floor of the Pantheon. And so you can see it's kind of scalloped here. And so the Romans figured out something. The Romans were tremendous engineers. And they figured out, by scalloping the stone in this particular way, you could distribute the weight of the building, and it would stand on its own. It wouldn't collapse. And when these Florentine Renaissance architects came down to study the building, they didn't have that knowledge anymore, and they had to kind of really close up and look. How did the Romans do this, and build upon that particular knowledge? Here's a shot of the building from the ground floor. It's a remarkable building. I mean, there's some lost elements up in the pediment, and some of the marble facing on the outside is gone. But more or less, the building is today as it was nearly 2,000 years ago. Here's a shot from the inside. And so there's the oculus, and so it almost acts like a sundial. And so the bright Roman sunshine will kind of make a spotlight that kind of goes around the building, depending on the time of year and the height and the rising and the setting of the sun. But inlaid with all kinds of precious marbles. Today it's no longer for a while it was turned into a Christian church, but later on it becomes a cemetery. And so Italian notables such as Raphael are buried here. Vittorio Emanuele, who's kind of the modern Italian George Washington, the founder of modern Italy, he's also buried here amongst others. It's a tremendous tourist attraction. It's free to go in, but it's a remarkable building. And so this was the great inspiration for Brunelleschi. Figure out how the Romans do it and then build upon that knowledge. So yeah, here's a picture of kind of what his wooden frame may have looked like. He had that all put together, and then against kind of the wicker work of the outside, he laid the bricks and then put the stone over top of it, and then with a keystone at the top, kind of holding the whole thing together by its own weight. Here's a drawing of kind of a hoisting machine with gears and pulleys, and kind of a pack animal to kind of walk around, and this would kind of hoist the materials that the workmen would need, being way up there in the upper ether, putting this whole thing together. What a terrifying experience that must have been. Here are some drawings from Brunelleschi's own notebooks that still survive, where he's kind of writing out all of his directions. So an incredibly supple and agile and inventive mind to solve these problems. But that's a hallmark of the Renaissance. Find something that the Romans had did, figure out how they did it, and then take it even further, and do it even better, or expand upon it, make it bigger, at least. Yeah, here's a close up of the brickwork, in the dome of the Florentine cathedral. It's amazing. It's if you go to the cathedral today, you can actually climb the dome. There's actually a passageway between the brickwork and the outer layer of stone, and you can walk up this curved ramp. And so all the way along, as you're kind of leaning over, you can put your hand against this brickwork here, and to go all the way up to the lantern on top and get a great view of the city. But again, just by putting it in this zigzag pattern, Brunelleschi found it was a much more efficient way to distribute the weight, rather than kind of layer it all horizontally. When you do that, you're just kind of continually putting pressure and pressure and pressure on the lower levels, and even with light bricks, the whole thing you stack 4 million of them. The weight is too much to hold together. But by stacking them in the zigzag pattern, he found a way to kind of distribute the weight much more evenly and efficiently, and to take the pressure off the lower parts of the dome. So yeah, so here you see it in full color here. He didn't decorate the whole outside with heavy marble. The heavy marble stops here, and that was already there. But he had to use lighter stone, and he had to use kind of tile roofing. But in so doing, kind of that red-orange color matches a lot of the roof colors in Florence, and so the building fits very well with the rest of the urban landscape. And here are some of those semi and half domes that act as buttresses, kind of holding up the whole building, and taking some of the pressure off the lower parts of his dome. Absolutely ingenious. He probably also, I don't think Brunelleschi ever traveled here, but again, this kind of thing had been done before. A massive temple called Hagia Sophia, means Holy Wisdom, built in what we call Istanbul, was originally built as a massive Christian cathedral in the 6th century AD, the 500s. You can see by the minarets later, when this area was conquered by Islamic forces, it was changed into a mosque, and it was a mosque, I believe, until the early part of the 20th century. And now it's a museum. And if you go to Hagia Sophia, you can kind of see elements of both its Christian and its Islamic heritage. But here you can see, again, a massive dome. And one of the ways it stands up, it holds up, is you see some of these side domes on the building acting as the buttresses. It's exactly the same kind of thing that Brunelleschi did in Florence. Here's a drawing of kind of all the main buildings. There's kind of 3 main buildings in the cathedral complex. Of course, the cathedral itself. Here's the main kind of octagonal altar, which is capped by an octagonal dome. This is what Brunelleschi did. There's an incredible frieze that was painted, not by Brunelleschi, I think his name was Vasari. An incredibly ornate frieze that was painted on the interior of the dome, just to kind of cap things off. This massive bell tower here, part of the complex, and then this baptistry down here, which was the second prize that was given to Ghiberti. And he was allowed to kind of show off his own artistic skills in putting that together. Here it is, and it was a building that was instrumental in Brunelleschi figuring out a lot of things about architecture, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And again, it's octagonal shape, or I think it's octagonal or hexagonal. And the style of marble that he used, it was meant to complement the dome or the cathedral that's just across the street. We're kind of looking from the steps of the cathedral towards the baptistry. It's a remarkable, kind of beautiful building in its own right. Michelangelo was actually commissioned to design the doors of the building, the so-called kind of gates of heaven, as it were. And again, ornate, beautiful sculpture and layered in gold. Just the amount of detail and precious materials that went into these kinds of things is absolutely extraordinary. Now, one of the things that Brunelleschi figured out, or I should say not figured out, but rediscovered, was what we call linear or one-point perspective. And he kind of rediscovered it by looking at the baptistry. And so there's a story that he had a picture of the baptistry painted on one side of a handheld panel. And then he put a hole so that he could look through it. And then he had a mirror which kind of pointed back at the baptistry, and then another hole by which he could look through and kind of see the baptistry itself. And by doing this, my mind doesn't really work this way, but by doing this, he discovered what we call linear perspective, or kind of the so-called vanishing point, which is kind of taken for granted in drawing kind of a realistic, particular, any kind of landscape, urban or rural. You find where the vanishing point is, and that becomes kind of where if you were drawing a road, the wider part of the road is at the front of the picture, so to speak, but then it kind of goes together, and ultimately kind of the lines of the road meet where it vanishes. And so you use that as kind of a focal point and kind of understanding kind of on how to do architecture. So I want to show you this clip from Khan Academy, which explains this, in my opinion, fairly well. And then I'll say some things on the other side of it.
According to Filippo Brunelleschi's biographer, he stood just inside the main doors of the Cathedral of Florence when he conducted his first perspectival experiment. And that's where we're standing right now.
We're very close to it. Brunelleschi's experiment demonstrated that linear perspective could produce an incredibly realistic illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface.
So this notion that we can actually develop a system that would be relatively easy to follow, but highly accurate, that could translate the volumetric world that we move through time onto a frozen two-dimensional surface is really an extraordinary achievement. There's some discussion among scholars as to whether or not there was linear perspective in the ancient world, but if there was, it was lost. And linear perspective was created, at least for us, in the modern world, by Brunelleschi in the 15th century, around 1420.
Right, and so some people say that Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective in case the ancient Greeks and Romans had had it before him.
Brunelleschi had gone to Rome and had studied antiquity, and some have hypothesized that he developed the basis for linear perspective in an attempt to be able to accurately portray the buildings that he was looking at, that he was sketching, that he was drawing.
It's certainly something that artists beginning really in the 1300s were creating forms. They were creating human figures that were three-dimensional by using modeling and making the figures bulky and monumental. Then you had the challenge of putting those figures within a believable space. Giotto and Duccio had kind of approximated that space and began to create a kind of earthly setting for their figures, but had not achieved perfect illusion of space for their figures to inhabit.
As the culture becomes increasingly analytical, mathematical, it's a trade-based culture. This is a culture that in some ways may have demanded of its artists a kind of precision, a kind of mathematical accuracy in its representation. And Brunelleschi delivers that. So what does he do?
Brunelleschi creates a perspectively accurate image of the baptistry and its surround.
Right. So Brunelleschi develops a system with just a few essential elements, and through these elements is able to construct accurate scientific one-point perspective. They include a vanishing point, which is at the viewer's horizon line, as well as a series of orthogonals or illusionistically receding diagonals. What Brunelleschi then does is he paints or draws an image of the baptistry with linear perspective and puts a small hole in the center of it. He takes that small drawing or painting, puts a handle on it, and holds it in front of his face, but facing away from him. He then takes a mirror and holds it in back of that. Now remember, his painting has a small hole in it, so he can see through it straight to the vanishing point.
So he's holding the mirror at arm's length, and the actual painting with the hole in it right in front of him for his eye to look through.
Right. So you can see the painting's reflection in the mirror, and if he pulls the mirror away, he can see the actual baptistry, and he can bring the mirror back to see the painting, move the mirror away to see the actual baptistry, and see if in fact those lines are well coordinated. And it was a very convincing experiment.
What Brunelleschi saw in the reflection of the painting looked exactly like the reality that was in front of him.
This would have the most profound effect on the history of Western art. Virtually every painting in the Western tradition after the 15th century is responding to linear perspective, either adopting it or very consciously rejecting it for some reason.
And within a couple of decades after Brunelleschi's discovery, Alberti, the brilliant architect and theoretician, writes a book called On Painting, in which he codifies Brunelleschi's discovery and creates a manual for artists of how to use linear perspective and how to make great paintings.
So yeah, I think that that explains it fairly well. I want to check a couple of things about they mentioned the Romans, and so here kind of a generic street scene, the kind of things we almost take for granted now, the vanishing point. and all the converging lines, that kind of stuff. Um, Brunelleschi, with his experiment, kind of recodified this or rediscovered it, and then it was later codified in Alberti's architectural manual. They had they got a couple of pictures there from wall paintings at Pompeii. Pompeii, the Italian city that was buried by Mount Vesuvius, the eruption in the year 79, and now has largely been excavated, and so lots of this interior art of these massive villas that wealthy Romans owned way back then seemed to suggest that if they didn't codify it, or they didn't write it down, they certainly instinctively understood the notion of a vanishing point. So here's a wall painting that it gives a three-dimensional illusion of kind of a small circular temple that's kind of beyond, deeper in some sort of courtyard. You can kind of see the lines here, right? The vanishing point. Here again, this is a wall painting that gives the illusion of a couple of benches here with some urns on it, or a small altar here. But of course, the surface is perfectly flat. So I would certainly say that the Romans, in particular, kind of understood the notion of a vanishing point, even if they didn't put it in those precise, architectural and mathematical terms. So yeah, I mean, there's examples of this kind of stuff is all over the place in Pompeii, and certainly this is the kind of knowledge that Brunelleschi is rediscovering, and then perhaps more mathematically, in a more mathematically precise way of writing it down and passing it along to later artists. So yeah, here you see Raphael, an artist I'm going to talk about just in a second. Here's a painting. I believe this hangs on the wall in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican complex. And here you have a biblical scene, and behind it, it's almost like Raphael says, "Look what I can do," and painting kind of an ornate Renaissance Italian Romanesque kind of building back there. But as these lines that have been added in, the vanishing point is that doorway, or kind of that tunnel that goes through the building there, that kind of organizes all the space. And so you see lots of different artists doing this kind of thing. We'll see lots of examples of this kind of stuff, and I'll call attention to it where it makes sense to do so. Another thing that kind of the Renaissance artist rediscovered or kind of built upon was in looking at kind of ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. And of course, Michelangelo thought of himself primarily as a sculptor. And there are many, sculptures, again, rediscovering, kind of copying Roman and Greek statues, and then again trying to take them further. And one of the things they discovered was what we call Contrapposto. And if you look at these statues here, you can see how this guy's kind of one foot is in front of the other, and it's leaning towards a kind of a much more natural pose, rather than just kind of having the 2 feet side by side exactly by each other, just this very kind of stiff column-like depiction. The Greeks and the Romans had started to figure out how to sculpt the human body more naturally. And you can see from this example and this example, they're not quite there yet. It's still, kind of very stiff. It's, the arms are kind of, locked rigid down at the side. It's very Egyptian in many ways in its look. And some have suggested that the early Greek sculptors were actually influenced by connections with the ancient Egyptians. But if you look at, kind of this progression here from, Egyptian. Again, you see that 1 foot in front of the other, but still very rigid, very, very stiff. Maybe the early Greeks, the archaic Greeks, kind of again, the pose is so similar that it suggests a influence from one to the other. But you get into kind of the high point of the Greek era, the classical Greek era, 5th century BC. Look at how much more natural this figure looks. I mean, it's an idealized human body, but just kind of there's kind of a curve that goes through the. You can almost kind of see the curve of the spine and kind of the flexing of the hip. And here you do have 1 foot in front of the other, but this foot is raised. It's almost like he's taking a step. It's a much more kind of natural way of depicting the human body. And that kind of balance we call contrapposto. And so here you kind of see it like on this modeler's a mannequin here, that the human body is not rigidly geometric from top to bottom in the way that we tend to walk or pose or stand. There's lots of kind of angles and curves. So you might have kind of a rigid pole, which kind of aligns the whole thing from the middle, top to bottom. But the slope of the shoulders and the flex of the hips tend to kind of point in different directions. And so here you see this is a statue called the Doryphoros, the spear bearer. The spear's missing, but he once had a spear. And again, I don't have to explain it to you. It just looks much more natural, much more realistic. And this is what the Renaissance sculptors like Michelangelo seized upon and then pushed that realism in even greater directions. So here we have Donatello, an artist we'll talk about in another lecture. This is David, the biblical figure who's just cut off Goliath's head. This is Michelangelo's David, same biblical character who's got the sling on his shoulder. He's about to face down Goliath in that famous kind of underdog story. And again, the lines of the slide maker here just kind of show all of the curves and different angles in David's body, which give it a kind of an idealism, the perfect balance in a human body, but it's also much more realistic than, say, an Egyptian or early Greek statue. Now, a bit more about Raphael. An artist whose painting I just showed you with that vanishing point. Some have considered him to be, again, this is all subjective, but the one who kind of perfected Renaissance painting. We think of Renaissance painters, we think of Michelangelo and Leonardo, but I would say that neither Michelangelo or Leonardo considered themselves primarily artists with a paintbrush, although they were very capable of this. But Raphael, the core of his artistry was centered in the art of painting. And so, he improved perspective and realism. He was a great admirer of Leonardo and Michelangelo, studied them. They were contemporaries. Raphael became the favorite of the painter of the Pope because of his extreme realism and his attention to detail. And many of his paintings, one in particular, he liked to kind of combine contemporary people, important people from his own day and age, with paintings of famous Greeks and Romans, kind of mingling amongst them as a way of kind of visually kind of connecting that ancient Greek and Roman past to the so-called Renaissance present. This is arguably probably his most famous painting. It's called The School of Athens, and it's actually, he painted it on the wall in the private apartments of one of the popes. Today, it's, if you go to the Vatican museums, it's part of the tour. The Pope no longer lives in these particular apartments, and so they're open to the public. If you buy a ticket. And this was on one of the private rooms of the Pope. But here I can note the vanishing point. He's kind of got this very kind of wildly imagined architecture with the curved the curved tunnel-like atmosphere. And you can see the sky behind it, and everything kind of focuses your attention right on here. Not now. I'm lecturing. Please go away. No, you can't. And so in the middle here we have two famous figures from Greek philosophy. On the left here we have Plato, who most people think that Raphael is using the face of Leonardo da Vinci to put him on the body of Plato as a way of honoring him. And then here is Aristotle. So kind of the two great philosophical thinkers. And you notice that Plato is pointing up, and Aristotle, his hand is kind of pointing down. So they're having an argument here. And it has to do with kind of their core philosophies. Plato pointing up, he says, the real reality is up in the heavens. It's something transcendent. It's with God or the gods up there. And Aristotle's pointing down. He says, no, real reality down here is on the earth. And so Plato was much more kind of a philosopher of the mind, metaphysical philosopher, and Aristotle was much more kind of a philosopher of the earth. He was much more interested in biology and animals and plants and that kind of stuff. And so he's a much more kind of a physical science kind of guy. But between them, we get kind of this whole kind of coherent picture of kind of Greek philosophy, from the ethereal to the metaphysical, down to the grounded on the earth. And then there's all kinds of other figures. Not all of them, I believe, have been identified from the ancient Greek and Roman past. I think here's Socrates himself having a debate like he'd like to do. Down here, actually, Raphael has put the face of Michelangelo on, I believe, the body of some kind of famous Greek mathematician. And other different philosophers kind of congregated about, both kind of ancient and closer to Raphael's time. He imagines them all together in some kind of grand school of the greatest minds that ever lived. And in fact, Raphael, right here, he puts himself, this young beardless kid, just poking out. It's almost like a little in-joke here. But Raphael says, he's kind of, it would be very vain of him to kind of put himself right in the middle of all of these guys. But he says, I'm pretty good. So I belong in this school as well. And so he put himself kind of peeking out here. There's lots of those kinds of wonderful kind of little in-jokes that Renaissance painters would put into their works. Michelangelo was a master at this kind of stuff, and we'll look at this stuff. It's wonderfully fun to kind of to pick apart and to notice and to try to understand, what is Michelangelo up to, and what is he trying to say with these kinds of things. But this is kind of, in some ways, kind of the ultimate Renaissance picture. You have you have the faces of Michelangelo, the face of Leonardo. You have figures, thinkers, and movers and shakers from the Renaissance all the way back to antiquity. Imagine them all together. And in some ways, that's kind of the message of the Renaissance, is that we are casting our line way back to the ancient Greek and Romans. We're connecting ourselves to them, and we're going to take their knowledge, and we're going to push it in even more wild and exciting directions. All right, that's all I got for you for this one. I will talk to you soon.